Greetings, friends. Getting this going in a moment. I think we're mostly set up here. As usual, anyone who's popping on, feel free to say hi. Don't be obligated to chat and interact, but it's always better when people do. That's the point of tonight, the 7 p.m. Wednesday chats. It's as much about interacting as it is about me up here being a talking head for an hour and change. A lot of my regular viewers are away this weekend or this week doing cool stuff, and I'll be doing that as well. This will be the last of these Tavern chats for at least 1 week and possibly 2 weeks, depending what time I get back and how things go. Returning from Norway, not this Tuesday, but the following Tuesday. If I get in early like I'm supposed to, I could probably rest up and by Wednesday be ready to do the chat. If I'm sitting in an airport someplace waiting for a plane Tuesday at midnight and I finally get back here at some ridiculous time in the morning, I probably will skip the chat, but we'll see how it goes. Play it by ear. There's Justin. The croc has appeared. So for anyone coming on or watching this later, Wolfie, hey man, there's Ross, how's it going? Anyone who's going to be good. Yeah, good. As I was just saying, I'll see. I won't be here next week, but I'll see how it goes. Maybe 2 weeks we'll resume. Do my shtick. Eclipse. Ah, there you are. I assume this is also Omega. Or Mark, as he's better known. Good to see you. See how many people tune in tonight. Okay, says I've got a few people on lurking, which is always good. A few of the regulars are here already. So, just to give it a glad you're here, Mark. Hope you're doing well. We haven't really gotten to talk the past couple months, but hope things are going good for you. So we've got this Twitch stream, obviously, from the Tomes. If you're here watching this live, you know that it's here. I don't have to tell you where it is. However, I do also have a YouTube channel, so if you could go over and subscribe to that, that'd be great. These are all going to be archived there long term. There's already about 30 chats up there now. various grades of focused or not. Oh, this is Damien. Hey, how's it going? I thought it was Mark. Because Mark said he was going to jump on tonight too. And so, are you Omega or is somebody else Omega over on Discord? I thought Mark was Omega. I don't think you know Mark. He graduated a few years ago. Well, graduated last year. But if you're watching this on YouTube, head over to From the Tomes. And anyway, good to see you too, Damien. I just thought you were someone else for a moment. Fox on Board Games at foxonboardgames.com. That's the. Let's see. No, Wolfie is no. That's actually not Nick. It's a good guess, but it's not. Actually, that's another friend of mine, Russell. So, who's more my age and I know from outside of school. So, but yeah, I would have guessed that too, because he uses that handle too. So, foxonboardgames.com, and then over on Twitter and Facebook at Fox on Board Games. And as usual, please like and support and chat here, and you can comment elsewhere and tell me what you like about all this, what you don't like about all this. I'm fine. I'm glad to hear all kinds of feedback. I'm quite used to it. And I guess we're gonna start rolling for tonight and see where this takes us. So. And here we go. So, if you've been watching the past week or so, that I've been working on this material, you'll know that the bulk of the time has been spent getting the character creation document for my game together. Tabletop role-playing, sword and sorcery. What I think is a little unique about it in terms of most of these games is that it's human-centric. As of now, there is no non-human playable race. And in fact, the number of non-human races out there in this world are very small. And they are not dwarves and elves and all these other things we see from fantasy games. And I have a lot of discussion with this, and Damien is one of my students. Sometimes Nikki comes on, who's a former student as well. And, they can both attest. In my classes, I talk a lot about this. And if you've been to the game jams with me, you know that one of the things that I do there is I talk about why certain things are a certain way in a game environment. And if you look at a lot of popular games, they're obviously like really deep. I mean, look at something like Skyrim or some of these others. The level of cultural development is very deep. And what's being done to make these cultures unique? Well, I have, in fact, oh, there you are. There's Capo, there's Nikki. So, I know what I do. And I know this is good. And so again, we know that this chat probably won't be as fun and controversial as some of my topics that I've thrown out there to watch people maybe get a little bit riled up and have these discussions with them. Yeah, that's fine. I don't know if you're still in Florida or for what you're doing. I was just saying, a lot of the people who come on regularly now are out now as the summer winds down. They're doing a lot of things, and I'll be out for a little while. So part of my challenge in writing this game was putting to test all those things I talk about. Like, I joke around a lot, and I say like, all right, so you watch your fantasy movie or read your fantasy book or read your fantasy games. Why are all the elves basically alike? I go home. Cool. And why, and even more so, like, why are they basically just like humans with pointy ears? Why isn't there any attempt to make them deeper in cultural construct? Now, obviously, there are the major exceptions, right? Why do all dwarves have Scottish accents? It's this kind of like very superficial treatment of all this cultural stuff. And we talked a little bit about this when we discussed fantasy races, perhaps 4 weeks ago. And I joked around that, same kind of thing. Most game fantasy races are basically just cardboard cutouts and some variation of human. And even if you watch popular movies like Star Trek, Star Wars was the first to maybe introduce these completely kind of alien, even if they were in the background, they weren't the main characters, these very, very alien creatures that seem to have their own entire identity. But, early Star Trek, for example, and some of these others, you're kind of like, man, they're kind of just people with a quirk, And I've always wondered, now guaranteed, all that's evolved. Like Star Trek's really evolved, of course, and Star Wars has really evolved, of course. But a lot of the game settings I've read, especially they deal with any kind of, yeah, there's Bobicus, boo, I agree. I don't know if you were booing lame fantasy races or if you're saying boo like surprise, you're here. Either way it works. Oh, good. Oh, cool, good. I'm glad you got something working. Now to play test it, like we were saying yesterday. But yeah, so get surprised. So yeah, it's always a good feeling when something actually think you finally have it in place, where you're like, oh wow, I think this is actually gonna work. Some of what I've talked about as I've been working on these various races is, what do you do to make cultures? What do you do to make the cultures unique? Throw them to me. Yeah, throw them up in the chat. I'll take a look at them later. The way I do these chats on the Wednesday nights is I kind of go through a script, not really a script, a set of prompts, and then I throw the topic out for everyone to chat with. But definitely throw it up there because there's a lot of people on here who could probably take a look at your doc and also maybe give you some feedback. So, okay, links no go in chat. All right. Feel free. What's that one bad? Stop posting links. Oh yeah. Oh, Nightbot. Look, Nightbot is scolding you. I will change that, by the way. Shouldn't even be a thing. Sorry about that. Let me go over to Nightbot. Nightbot's finally working, but now it's stopping you from doing something we want you to do. Oh, come on. I should be logged in. Thank you. Let's see. Spam protection. Links. Let me disable that. Link blocking is disabled. See if you can post a link now. Sorry about that. It's like my Zoom classes, right, guys? Oh, yeah, sure. Share your screen. Oh, we can't share our screen. Well, whose fault is that? Oh, wait. I guess it's mine. There we go. There we go. Yep. I thought I had disabled it the other day. But as you remember yesterday, yeah, I will definitely... Let me copy this and archive... Oops. Let me copy this and archive it. Because I'll definitely want to take a look at it later. I'll be on tomorrow too, so if you want to talk about it more tomorrow, cool. I will keep this in the tab. It is now in my Google. If you want to talk about it more tomorrow when I'm on streaming, we'll definitely talk about it. So I'm going to just take a look at the Melech. I was going over my various cultures today. And I was like, well, which one am I going to talk about and how am I going to frame this? So when it comes to fantasy races, some games definitely do a better job of it than others. Now, the downside of this is, for example, if you looked at second ed Dungeons and Dragons, where you had these character race books coming out, and first of all, it was almost like some of the White Wolf Clan books or White Wolf games or the codexes for Warhammer. Like everything that came out was like more powerful than the last thing. By the time the Elf Handbook came out, they were like immune to everything and could fly and could throw two pole arms and catch them. I mean, this is all exaggeration, but you were reading it and you kind of started to feel like this. You were like, every one of these character races comes out with a new book. And 3.5 and 3.5 kind of got like that too after a while. And I think that's a hazard of any of these games. Or, like I've done 40K in decades, 2 decades or more. But it was the problem with that too. Like every codex that came out, the next army was like more powerful than everything else, except the Imperial Guard, who were never more powerful than anything, which was always the point of the Imperial Guard. It's part of they were fun. But I had to make some cultures for this game. So, and by the way, of course, anybody has any ideas or any thoughts, just throw them out there. But we have this land that I created that, as I've said several times, is kind of analogous to a Fertile Crescent culture. It is less of your traditional fantasy world, and it's earlier. It's like Iron Age, perhaps early Iron Age. There's a little bit of steel, but not in most cases, except for the Melech, actually, not very good steel. And I wanted to kind of develop. Wanted to catch my typos too. Live editing, catch my typos. I wanted to develop this culture that had some familiarity and was unique, and I decided there was going to be a horse culture in this grasslands, what they call the Great Plains, which is kind of the centerpiece of this world as it stands. And they're going to be a horse culture. They're going to be rooted in savanna or Great Plains culture. So optically, they're somewhere between Southern Central Africans and Native Americans who both had, well, the Africans did not exactly have a horse culture, but they did have a nomadic plains culture. So I took that element from there, and then I took some elements of the horse cultures of the Great Plains and the steppes horse cultures, the Mongolian horse cultures, and I kind of developed this semi-agrarian, semi-nomadic herding and hunting and gathering. Horse. Oh no, they rely on horses. That's a very good question, right? Are they centaurs? Are you telling me they centaurs? I never thought of that, right? That could be the secret of the game. The backstories are actually the. Well, I won't get into it. That could get kind of raw. Yeah, I could tie in centaurs in there, but I'm not going to. I know a band that has a song about centaurs. And they have a very good centaur joke they tell before it, which I'm not going to repeat here. Use your imagination, and it's probably correct. But, so yeah, no, they rely on horses. A lot of their life is on horseback. Those that aren't horse people are generally herders or farmers. They are very strong in terms of their crafts. That's one of the things the culture has really evolved. Now, as a really deep backstory, they originally had spread all over the continent of this particular the plains of this particular continent. Then when there was the supernatural cataclysm, supernatural erosion of the world, there part of what happened is their grasslands all started dying out. Now, they are in fact. Do I talk about their religion and spirituality here? They're a little bit. So they're animistic, and they feel they have an animistic connection with the grasslands. And in fact, there is a lake in the middle of the savannah, oasis like, but I can't really call it an oasis because it's properly a desert environment. So it's more like a fairly large inland lake, a pool. Maybe we'll call it a pool. That'd probably be a better description. That's in this temperate rainforesty grove, and they believe that the very first progenitor of their people sprung out of this grove, out of the trees on this grove. So when everything natural started dying, when there was this supernatural infestation, this obviously completely disconnected them from their territory. And it disconnected them from their own spiritual identity to a degree. So what part of the driving goal of this culture is now to try to reclaim all this land, which they've started doing, and to kind of reinvigorate the natural elements of this land and of their own history. And I needed to try to avoid stereotypes. That was the biggest thing. Especially dealing with cultures that are not Eurocentric, that are not European. One of my biggest challenges in developing this was to not make these cartoon African people or cartoon Native Americans, right? So I had to really try to dig in and look at the roots of both of those cultures in our world and go back and think about, well, how would they evolve? How would these same roots spring up from this alien world? I mean, it's a fantasy world, but it could be another planet. I mean, it orbits a red giant sun, and it's got 2 moons. So clearly it's not Earth. Like there's nothing Earth-like about it. It is not meant to be proto-Earth. It's not meant to be future Earth. So why? What was that question for there, Eclipse? Why what? Curious as to what the last was. I'll see what the why entails. Because stereotypes are just that. And while they allow us to easily access something, it could be. Well, okay, so let's clarify. Other people of this land might stereotype them as primitive people who live out in the grass, right? And in fact, some of them do. There are two cultures which still think of these people as these, for lack of a better word, kind of redneck, people who live out in this grass, and they're not civilized. They don't come live in the city like we do, with all of our arenas and brothels and all this, right? But I, as a writer, did not want to draw on real world ethnic stereotypes, which hold negative connotations. If I suddenly gave them these kind of movie African names and these movie Indian names, that would kind of denote my perspective as a Eurocentric writer imposing these stereotypes on other people. A good example of this is, and this goes outside of gaming, but I don't think this only applies to gaming, is Fraser's Golden Bough, which is cited, it was written in the 20s or maybe even earlier, I have to check the date, as one of the primary sources of, we'll call it paganism, and not paganism as in New Age witch stuff. Paganism is a rural folk tradition. But the problem is the language that he couched all of this research in. And again, this was a affluent white researcher from the 20s. Well, yeah. Oh, well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we'll talk about that. But we have the Golden Bough, but every time he talks about these people, especially the non-white people that he's researched, he immediately switched this language that they're somehow these quaint primitive people who have these bizarre beliefs, right? And that was a product of that time. I mean, that was, again, we've talked about this in classes. We've talked about writers like H.P. Lovecraft or Robert E. Howard, both of whom have been hugely influential in fantasy, and, or even Tolkien to a lesser degree, phrases things in a way that you kind of just, now, you kind of just rub your head and you're like, oh man, that was rough. But right, so there's definitely an influence, and that's part of what I'm talking about here as well. Like, we can't create anything out of a bubble and have it be believable, right? We can't just create something and claim that we've never had any influence from the real world. The Empire is unapologetically, the Nazis. They call their army stormtroopers. I mean, there was no chance that you weren't going to make that equivalent, that you weren't going to have that leap. So we have to draw on our own real world. Like, I've drawn on cultures that I sat down and researched, and namings traditions that I sat down and researched. But I think it would be different if I just slapped these non-white people into this world and then threw really bad, like, movie stereotypes. So slavery, that's a very good question, Bobicus. Very good. And I've had to deal with that because there is slavery in this world. And in fact, two of the cultures are avid slavers. They have no prohibition against it. They don't at all discriminate. They will enslave. For the Hapshar are the primary slavers. They were formerly empirical. They were formerly empirical people. Their empire has now crumbled. They live in this decaying city, kind of like the Melnibonéans in Elric. They're very similar to that. I drew unapologetically from that and from post-Roman culture. They will enslave their house, their own people. Like, they're divided into houses. Their noble houses are divided up. And if there's a house war and there is a losing family, a portion of that family may get enslaved. And that's the way it is. And it's an uncomfortable discussion, especially because I'm dealing with a lot of non-European cultures. But historically, slavery was a fact of life, unfortunately, until, well, I would argue that it still is in some places. And it might take a different form. Without going off the political deep end, there are institutions in place, even in the West, that are in effect slavery. Maybe they're economic slavery, right? They're not necessarily the traditional vision that we have that's easy to identify. Though in some parts of the world it does still exist. So even in a criminal underground fashion. So it is there. It is there. And I do have a write up in the very beginning of the book that working in Amazon equals slavery. Yeah. Well, student debt, right? Let's in America at least, right? You're indebted for $200,000 or whatever for the rest of your life. That has accruing interest to a bank. Like again, these are all big topics, and we talk about this in class sometimes too. But it is always difficult because I've been in games, I've been in live action games, I've been in other environments where these sorts of discussions come up and people get very upset by them. And not without good reason. But if I'm going to have a world that portrays effectively a fantasy version of our own world 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, or a part of our own world 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, with sorcery and monsters and demons and whatever that are actually out walking around instead of metaphorical, this idea of slavery it has to be incorporated. And in fact, in the very first playtest scenario, Blood Out of Bondage, you start as slaves and you have to fight your way out. Not fight your way, but there's a task you must do to earn your freedom. And it's for one of the Hampshire houses. So it's there. And I do have a write-up in the beginning. And I very clearly state my opinion that in a quasi-historical setting, it would be disingenuous of me to, or let's say a historically inspired setting, it'd be disingenuous of me to simply say, oh, well, no, that doesn't exist in my world because it's uncomfortable. So that's my approach on it. And it's interesting that you brought it up because I hadn't really planned to go in that territory tonight, but it's essential. It's an essential discussion when dealing with these games. And I've read a lot about how it's dealt with in other games. So it's, and it's interesting. There was actually a post on one of the D&D groups I'm on recently where they started talking about this a little bit, and they showed like 4 or 5 of the original D&D modules, and they all like had the word slave or slaver or slavery in the title. And in the inspirational works of this game and of the early D&D, some of the sword and sorcery and fantasy stuff that came out of particularly the 20s through, let's say, the 60s, this was not even a question. I mean, the fact that there was this element of slavery in these worlds, it was a reality. So yeah. So how do I deal with it? So the way I deal with it in my games is it's present. I certainly don't glamorize it, make it a great thing. And I simply say in the prelude to the book, every game master is going to deal with this in their own way. And they have to understand where their players are at. They have to understand the maturity level of the players. They have to understand the age of the players. Now, my game is definitely not for like 10 and 12-year-olds. It is violent. It is dark. It is a dark fantasy with horror overtones as well. So I don't anticipate this is something you're going to sit down with your 13-year-old cousin and play. Unlike D&D, which you can. And in fact, Justin, who's lurking on here, has run wonderful games for his daughter and her cousins and I think some friends, 6 years old. And again, they're very light. They're very fun. They have to defeat raccoons and, stuff like that. It's not kill them, but actually just defeat them in some other way. So it's very productive. This game is pretty blood and guts. This game is not a game that is going to be necessarily for family night. Family night at the table. Let's go play the game. So I expect people coming into this game will probably have their own perspective and their own way to discuss it and deal with it. And like I said, I was at a LARP before pandemic, actually. This was before pandemic. I've been there since pandemic. But before pandemic, there was a whole scene of like slavery and torture and stuff. But it was consensual among all the players. Like all the players knew that, The family that stays together stays together. Yeah, let's all play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay tonight, kids. Let's see who gets their bowels wrapped around a pole arm tonight, as one of the critical hit tables would say, or Middle Earth Roleplay. So this goes back to all of our discussions. Cheers, man. See you later, Justin. Good seeing you. So this goes back to all of our discussions too. That you have to know your group, and you have to know your table, and you have to know who's going to be there, and you have to maybe adjust accordingly. So it's nothing I can really shy away from. Not in this game at any rate. Like in my D&D game, it's not really a thing. Quite unrealistically, this pseudo-medieval fantasy environment doesn't have slavery. At least not except by the evil races, like the gnolls or the bugbears or the orcs or whatever. I mean, yeah. But again, so there goes where we're talking about cultural development. So I'm talking here a little bit about the cultural development of except for the use of like magic and stuff like that, in the gross sense, of a realistic culture. I was striving to make a culture that could be believable. That you could sit down and look at the Melok, or any of the cultures here, except maybe the Varenka, who, as I've said a couple times this week, are like the Dunwich Horror, H.P. Lovecraft sorcerer extended family cults. They're distinctly like right out of a fantasy novel. That was very intentional. And you could look at the Melek, you could look at even the Hapshar or the Fror. Now, the Fror are kind of an exaggerated mountain people, similar to how some people would maybe think, if I'm going to have like Vikings in my game, they'd look kind of like this, but they're not at all Scandinavian. They're actually closer to Hungarian culturally. They're all just very large. they're very large. They're Hungarian with maybe a very little bit of North Asian. Tibetan, Mongolian, very kind of an Asiatic feel to their appearance and some of their cultural standards. But you could still look at them. Right, exactly. Yeah. They had a feudal system, right? Medieval Europe had a feudal system. And that's absolutely, so there are outliers. And there's everybody's kind of an outlier. Like in the setting background, everybody's kind of, they're on their own, but they have to work together because they're trying to, in a way, maintain this new civilization against what's on the other side of the forest. Because there's a big forest that is new growth of the last 1,000 years, which, yes, it's magical. That's inhabited by things. And then beyond that, there's other things. And most of these modern humans don't know what has happened on the other side of the forest. So that's kind of the gimmick. So these people all kind of are working together, these 6 or so cultures, even though they are not the same people, because they are kind of more afraid of what could be out there than they are of each other for the moment. I haven't really set up any kind of military conflicts or political conflicts beyond kind of normal political trade-related conflicts. There are definitely outliers, and in every culture there are outliers. And I established these kind of deep cultural norms for all these various people. But in almost every description I say, but there are people who go off and do this. Perhaps the one culture that's a little bit tougher to do that with, and not even really, are the Rubari. And they are the most proto-Indic, Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamian-ish, blatantly so culture there. They have, a very Babylonian city. There's sprawling gardens and ziggurats. And, they have this kind of mystic order that oversees the city. They have this huge scriptorium. They're the one city that did not fall during this entire infestation of creatures and evil and all this other, the usual stuff. The usual stuff that makes it a fantasy game. And then they have this really strict caste system in place. And that's the cinch of that culture where you're like, oh, this is the place where my character would want to live. Oh, maybe not, because it's a true caste system, and that if you're born into it and your role is to you know, pick dead bodies out of the river your entire life, well, that's what you're doing. Now, again, I also, because it's and I talk about this in terms of gender too. So along with the whole slavery thing goes gender norms, right? Now, first of all, we live in an age where we are understanding, in a modern context, that gender norms are constructed, right? We've made them all up, like, you know, whoever has whatever gender aside from literal biological sex is determined by organs and DNA, and even that has gray areas. You know, this idea of gender roles being so strictly enforced is actually fairly modern, because we look at a lot of historical cultures, they had sections of society at least that were extremely fluid as far as gender identity. And in fact, even Native Americans. And though they don't like to talk about it because of the whole macho Viking thing, even the Scandinavians had classes of people who did not fit. And we're finding this out more and more. As we're unearthing more grave finds, we're finding out about people who held prominent positions who did not conform to what we would think of as, you know, traditional gender roles. So I talk about that in the section of gender, much like the other cultural norms. First of all, it's a fantasy world, right? First of all, you want people to have fun playing this game. If I say to somebody, let's see. Oh yeah, well I've definitely played female characters. I've played, my character in Vampire right now is gender fluid is the best way to describe it. And describe him. He does call himself him, but he's definitely gender fluid. And his whole culture is where he came from in the 1920s, and the circuit he was in the 1920s would explain a lot of that. But it's, you know, he still is a modern character. He still is living in 2022 right now, or undead in 2022. So he realizes he can look however the F he wants, especially in the greater Philadelphia area. Like, people don't care, you know. We're not playing it. We're not playing in Deep Woods, Arkansas. You know, Vampire in Arkansas. That'd be Werewolf, actually. But you know, yeah, it's. I played all different genders, but even above and beyond that, I think it would be absolutely ridiculous for me to have in here, well, in Half-Shark culture, there are no female warriors. And if you want to play a woman, you cannot play a woman or female character, a woman-identified character. You cannot be a warrior or Half-Shark. I had a guy that did that in D&D years ago with Oriental Adventures. He pulled out Oriental Adventures and he wouldn't let one of the players, who was a woman, be a samurai. Because there were no real samurai. Well, there's not hairy dwarves. There weren't magicians throwing flaming shuriken at, you know, in real feudal Asia either. You know, it was like, you know, that really said a lot about him as a person, because he wouldn't bend on it. It was like one of those things he just wouldn't bend on. We were like, really, dude? Like, you know, one, it was the early 90s, and you actually have a woman that wants to play D&D with us, you know? Like, first of all, that was, you know, clearly an issue for him. But for everybody else, we're like, wait, there's actually, like, someone besides, you know, this hairy, long-haired guy sitting around a table? Like, you know, amazing. How does that even happen? You know, but then the guy was running the game, is like, oh, no, you can't play a samurai. We were like, really? So what do you want to play? A farmer's wife, you know? So again, I definitely do not want to set up that dynamic in this game. And I want to discourage it, because it's a fantasy game. You're supposed to have fun with it. You know? And it's like, yes, I put a lot of historical research into this and drawing in cultural elements and recognizable real-world culture elements that I could transfer to make a believable fantasy culture. But I don't want to make it that it's oppressive to play, or that nobody would actually enjoy playing this game. I've looked at a couple of, Tecumel is very problematic. Tecumel was out maybe around 1990, 91. And this guy was a professor, and he had written this game. And it was kind of scary, because at first I was reading, I had looked at it years ago when it first came out. Very interesting world, very primitive. 80s, was it in the 80s? Late 80s, I guess. Very primitive world. Yeah, was it that early? Wow. I guess I found it later. I found it like 91 or 92. A friend of mine brought it over. Neil, in fact, brought, or you mentioned it. I don't remember. I don't know if he's on tonight. But so it was really interesting because it was a case where he had made up this entire sophisticated culture and language and all these other things. Well, unfortunately, it's come out in the past 10 years or so that the guy was a screaming anti-Semite and bigot. And now, and it was funny because I was originally going to do like a whole segment talking about this game and how interesting it was. And I just happened to run a web search on it, and things kept coming up like, oh, is so-and-so who wrote this game a racist or whatever? And I was like, oh, I mean, again, I'm definitely, as anybody who knows me in person can attest, I'm definitely progressive, definitely culturally sensitive. But I'm like, I don't know, are people just taking something he said out of context? No. They had a couple of his quotes that he had put in letters and in papers, and he had said to other faculty members at the time, and even for the 80s or 70s, it was like, it was like, yeah, this guy's like definitely not the guy I want to, who's the game I want to promote, even though he's dead now. But it's definitely, there are plenty of other games out there. I don't need to propagate a game written by a bigot, like a real bigot. Well, of course. Yeah, you know what? Sandy Peterson, my favorite game of all, Call of Cthulhu. Sandy Peterson has said some really turf, awful things recently. And I know he's this 70-something-year-old white guy now. I know that. And I still love the original Call of Cthulhu. I love Doom. Both these things were very influential in my young life. But it's just sad that, like, reading some of his comments recently, and it being abundantly clear he does not even, from his perspective, have an idea of why some of the things he said are as offensive as they are. Well, I don't think it's a bad idea. As long as you frame that history. I think as long as you frame it in a certain way. And I don't think it's, I mean, I've seen games run in Nazi Germany, or the backdrop is Nazi Germany. They're not comfortable. Well, yeah. I mean, it could be but see, that could be interesting. I think it's how you frame it. And I think it's how you couch the game to your audience. So let's say your knight travels to different worlds and sees different societies. I think, one, your game has a really comedic satire tone anyway, right? So I think you get away with being a little satirical. But I think you have to listen very carefully if somebody were to say, especially somebody of a particular culture were to say, one, what you're portraying in that game about my culture is not correct. It's a negative stereotype. Two, it is offensive in some way to somebody. Because I don't think you need to be. Like, again, I think this all goes down to, I mean, I grew up listening to some of the most offensive music that was out there at the time. And all of it, right, exactly. And all of it worked on the principle of pissing someone off, right? And I think there is a time and a place to do that to get a point across, maybe a political or a social point. But just having like a bad joke in a game about an ethnicity in 2022 is just taking cheap shots at people. Like Wolfie said, exposure to different cultures is one thing. Dismissing other cultures as inferior is entirely different. And that's the difference between, let's say, what I'm doing, hopefully, and what Tecumel did. Whereas Tecumel built up this entire primitive culture. Now, it's a weird thing that a lot of these people who have this kind of Nazi alignment, for lack of a better word, I mean, I don't know how to sugarcoat it, are also fixated with this idea of the noble savage, the American Indian, the unspoiled wilderness of the Amazon. And that somehow these people, even if they're not ethnically aligned with them, are more pure or more noble. And I mean, even Hitler himself had this kind of bizarre fascination with certain other cultures where he was like, they're an example of the Aryanism, even though they weren't white, even though they weren't, it was very, very strange. And that's a real disconnect for me. I don't quite get this, but you have to. It's fine exposing different aspects of different cultures, but I think it's really bad to sit down and say, yes, well, this imperial culture is superior to these inferior people who live in the bushes, no matter who they are, no matter who they are. I mean, I could say the same thing about rural Appalachia. Yes, there were a lot of South American and Asian elements. There were no Africanized elements, and there were no Semitic elements. And I think that says a lot. I think that says a lot about his opinions about people. Which, again, we can blame it on a lot of things, but it comes down to some people will always just have certain opinions. It's not my job to change them. It's not my job to fight them. But again, like I said, I had this whole thing where I was going to talk about Tecumseh and how interesting it was. And then I did some research and was like, ouch. Now, it's not like Varg. Varg's role-playing game of, Nordic fantasy, basically, like Wagnerian Nordic Varg from, originally from Burzum. You might know who he is, Wolf. I don't know if anyone else is on here knows who he is. The guy that ended up in the Norwegian jail, the neo-Nazi guy. And he's since written this role-playing game that's all about this fantasizing of, white purity, basically. I mean, he never says that, right? He never says that, but the cultures are all very Eurocentric, and, it's very bizarre. It's a bizarre thing. And I'm like, wow. And I've never read it. I won't read Varg's game. I don't listen to Varg's music. I'm just not going to. So I think, Damien, I think that's kind of the counterbalance is it's okay to have all this stuff in a game. It's okay to have even this really uncomfortable stuff in a game, but I think how you frame it is really important. And that's why, again, for all these cultures, I try to really avoid, one, any culture being considered superior to the other, because they aren't. Because they all have things that are good, and they all have things that are flawed. But at the same time, so the only exception to this could be the Varinka, and like I said, they're more like a kind of, cultist, demon worshipping, whatever. So this isn't a case where I would necessarily say they're better than anybody else, because they are pretty deranged. They're pretty corrupt. If they're closest thing to a player character villain society, and they're pure fantasy. I mean, I did not base those on anything except maybe, like I said, the Whateleys from Lovecraft. That's probably the closest analogy I have. The Suat was very hard because there are elements already in the background and their mobility that people could be like, oh, they're your gypsies. First of all, the term gypsy is not. Gypsy is a slang, is an offensive slang word. They're not Roma. They are not meant to be Roma. The fact that they are nomadic and that they blend in and move into different cultures, that simply has to do with their own cultural history. There was no intention of my sitting and making them anything else but who they are, and that's the Suat in this world. And will it ever come up? Will people say, oh, are they supposed to be Roma? No, they're not. Again, like, if you as a player want them to be Roma, that's fine. I'm not going to argue with you about it, but they are not meant to be that way. Very much like when people asked Tolkien if he was, and no, I'm not comparing myself to Tolkien. When Tolkien was asked if the orcs were the Nazis and the Fellowship were representative of the Allies in World War II, he said no. He said, if anything, it's more comparative to World War I, but it's a myth. It's a mythological construct. Middle-earth is not real, Middle-earth is not our world. Yes, you can draw these things from it, but it's not meant to be an analogy. So it's meant to be a retelling of Finnish, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon folklore is what it's meant to be. And that's why placing these bizarre stereotypes into some of the Tolkien renditions kind of really bugged me. Because I'm like, that's not what it's about, So I kind of rambled for the last 45 minutes, which I usually don't do during these chats. But I don't know. What do other people do? Zelda has a lot of mixture of cultures. Yeah, and mixtures of cultures are fine. I mean, all games do. All games do. I mean, I've sat through whole playings of Valhalla, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and all the Assassin's Creed games. They handle history really well. And in fact, I've had people tell me, "Oh yeah, I learned Greek mythology from Odyssey," and I think that's great. It's fantastic. And I'm definitely not about. And so this even goes to things like Civil War era games. Like you can't just suddenly say nothing bad in the Civil War happened. That's worse to me. Like hiding history is worse. Hiding the negative parts of history. You just have to acknowledge that yes, that was not, as a human species, our best idea. Let's not do that again. But so let's talk about this. Let's see if anyone else has any other ideas. And I talk about this in game jams too. Like, so when I walk around a game jam room and there's like a student saying, "Oh, I'm making this story about this serial killer, whatever, or this knight. He's using this kind of weapon." And my first question is always, "Well, why would he use that weapon?" "Oh, well, because it's cool." Okay, that's fair. Certain weapons are cooler than others. But why? Why does he have that weapon, or she, or why do they have that weapon? Why does this particular character pick up this item to use? Where does that come from? And how do we extend this to, say, fantasy races? Are all elves the same? Or is there a way to make elves in different games, or even different areas in an elven world, in a world populated by elves or with elves in it, so that they're culturally different? And not just they live in the woods, okay, right? Not just they live in the city, because those are kind of the superficial ways of treating it. Anyone have any thoughts? I've done my ramble, my 45-minute talking head talk, not TED talk, on what I've done when I think about creating cultures. Who else has done any work like this? I know some people who've been in my classes have, but because I've made them. I made them assignments. So like what? I mean, I think of the D&D stuff where there's some, like the newer D&D actually is a little bit more interest in terms of really making the elves, for example, culturally different. So there's the Eldar. Well, the Eldar, the Noldar. Yeah, obviously. That's the big one. Okay, aside from Tolkien, because he was a linguist. And so language and culture is at the heart of all of his writings. But I mean, yeah, that's not fair of me to say, because his characters were kind of two-dimensional as well. His character was Middle Earth. Everybody else was second. Middle Earth is the most interesting character in any of his stories. I think that was by design. If we want to talk about stereotypes, let's talk about the Dark Elves, the Drow, the Drow, from early D&D especially. I mean, that was kind of cringy when we think in retrospect too, because like the term Dark Elf, let's see, High Elves, Grey Elves, Moon Elves. So like the Moon Elves, and there's the Toriel and Forgotten Realms, and they're definitely a little more interesting too. The Drow are problematic because the term Dark Elf, at least in Scandinavian folklore, did not mean dark-skinned. It meant they had followed Loki and lived under the earth and had been cut off from the Tree of Life, or lived below the Tree of Life. That's why they were considered dark, because they were betrayers. They followed the betrayer. Less so than, like when Aronson and Gygax got a hold of them. Oh, the Dark Elves, they have dark skin. Again, in our modern context, we look at that, we're like, oh, that's not, that was, but that also followed Robert E. Howard, right? There weren't very many good guys. Right, exactly. And Ed Greenwood really changed them in Forgotten Realms. Yes, they still had the dark complexion, but they were, their culture, like especially the Menzoberranzan set, that was crazy. I mean, for the time to put that much effort into this underworld, So that was also a Marvel thing. Yeah, and Marvel borrowed heavily from the same mythology. So the term dark elf, I mean, they're related to dwarves and trolls, and in early Scandinavian and even British Isles folklore and Germanic folklore, these were all the same creature, like dwarves, elves, trolls. But like what differentiated light from dark is that one allied with the gods and goddesses of humanity, and the others effectively lived underground. Underground meaning the underworld. And they were generally in line with the gods and goddesses of chaos and darkness and all these other things. So that's where they originally came from. That's where the idea of this dark elf and light elf is sourced from. And there's some hell, right? Hell, or even deeper, the underworld where Loki was imprisoned. Because hell's very misunderstood too. Their underworld wasn't necessarily a place of evil. It was just where the dead went. And in fact, 99% of the population went there. Very few people, despite what a lot of modern Nordics will tell you, ever went to Valhalla. And if you were, that wasn't always a good thing. You were the chosen. You were the chosen, which means you had to die a horrible death to get there. And then once you got there, you just fought constantly to train for fighting the giants in the final battle. Like, again, people are like, oh, I'm Valhalla bound. I'm like, really? Have fun with that, buddy. Go get him, tough guy, The underworld was not even necessarily that bad of a place. But it was assumed that also in the underworld lived things of darkness. And in fact, dwarf and dark elf were originally kind of interchangeable, like the very early, and also a lot of what we see about in that particular mythology, a lot of the writing we have is post-Christian. So this idea of this light and dark, heaven and hell, is actually this very Christian idea that we're not even sure existed in early Germanic folklore. Obviously, there were elements. There was the element of the outside and the inside. Like, inside was your tribe. It was inside your house. It was your clan. You were safe. Beyond it was the woods. And in the woods lived the outsiders, the trolls, the other people, the people who weren't in your clan. Even if you were the same culture, they were the outsiders. They were the Utengard. Then there's the Innengard, which is the kind of the clan, the family. So it's very complex. So this is what I'm talking about in cultural development, right? So if we take a very simple view of it, like most of what we know from fantasy, from 20th century media and literature, there's this good and there's this evil. And we even see it in our elves, right? Whereas if you go back to these early tribal cultures where most of this stuff was sourced, oh yeah. So Eater of the Dead, 13th Warrior, right? It's blatantly fiction. Now I honestly don't have as much problem with some of that. Just like I don't have a problem with like Vikings TV show or Northmen or any of that, because these are meant to be the retelling of epic sagas. And if you read the actual Norse sagas, they were basically comic books. Skalla picked up 3 trolls with one hand and threw them through the wall while he was fighting them. I mean, Thor swung his hammer while he was fishing and killed 6 giants, and Mjolnir brought their heads back to him. I mean, these were obviously superheroic characters. They were probably actually based in real heroes, but they were turned into superheroes in these sagas. And that's actually why I don't have any problem with any of this modern Viking stuff going totally off the deep end. Right? Going so into fantasy that it's almost like a fantasy movie. I'm actually okay with it. I don't even have an issue with this. I'm like, yeah, but if you read their original stories, they were all like this. And now the only issue that I ever had with 13th Warrior was the armor. Because it was awful. The costuming. That was actually the issue I had with 13th. And even some of the Vikings TV show. But in Vikings TV show, it was intentional because they wanted to make the Vikings look like these superheroes. They wanted to make them look like Warhammer characters, which is basically kind of how they are, They're more like Warhammer characters than they are historical Vikings, both in look and in personality. So I don't know. Anyone done any cultural development? Anyone done any work on creating something like this? I mean, I admit it. When I play D&D, my cultures are pretty two-dimensional. My orcs are orcs. My gnolls are gnolls. My bugbears are bugbears. My dwarves are dwarves. But I also have a group that wants very easy to play, easy to access games where their characters are deeper. So I think that's a different discussion, a different game dynamic too. They don't necessarily need, when I tell them there's a castle and there's a wizard in it, they already all have an idea, and it's fine. And we move from there. And yes, the wizard has some personality, the castle has some cool people in it, but there isn't necessarily I don't sit there and work to develop an actual feudal replica of a medieval castle for them. Because it would be boring. Real castles are actually, except for the big palaces that you see pictures of, most actual medieval castles, most of those are Renaissance or later, some of them Baroque, and most medieval castles were pretty bleak. And I've been in a number of them. You think, yeah, living here wouldn't be very romantic, it wouldn't be very cool. First of all, it's the middle of the summer and I'm freezing, imagine the winter. I just had to walk up a, 1,000-foot slope basically to get up here. Imagine trying to do that with a horse cart and armor. That wouldn't be fun. Climbing this narrow stairwell in the middle of the night. This wouldn't be fun. What else you got for me? It's quite a few people lurking, but it's a quiet group, which is perfectly fine too. Welcome to the lurkers who have popped in. Thanks for coming. The cat's design more. I thought yours. Like I said, the best part about yours was just the description of those cats. It was so funny because it was like everybody wanted to play to encounter those cats after that. They're imps, but nobody takes them seriously because they kind of look like cats until they stab them with a pitchfork. I'm like, all right, I'm in. Yeah, I'm in. But right, so that's going to different civilizations. I think is a great idea. And you can even have like really fantasy versions of these civilizations because your game is blatantly really fantasy anyway. You're in no way claiming this is going to be realistic. You're in no way claiming this is any kind of experience in our real Middle Ages. I think having them go, spend elves in this world through Facebook. Okay, yeah, I'll take a look at it. I mean, I'm really interested in how people do it because I bust on the popular fantasy games a lot. Because they are culturally thin, in my opinion. But there are people out there, and especially people who are doing it independently, who are making some really cool stuff. No. Oh, it's defaulting to my Facebook page. All right, so let me switch it over to my main account so I can see what you sent me. Storm Elves, huh? Yeah, now I know 5th Ed has definitely brought... Let's see. Do you mind if I share this? He's not here to object. It's on a webpage. So if it were not on a webpage, I wouldn't share it. But I will share it. And part of my end discussion with this is what I discussed with like character backgrounds and all this kind of stuff. At what point is too much too much? Like I think the cultural development is great. I just think that there's also always the risk of possibly going so deep into this and you being the only one that knows any of it. Maybe it's important you know it. But, is it necessary for the players to know? And I'm going to go back to what I always say, like in my world building content. I'm just trying to get the... Yes, absolutely. It's always an issue, and not just with not just with cultures. I totally agree. My only counterbalance to that is, let's see, here's, move this over so it gets a little larger. Here's Jeremiah's stuff, the Storm Elves. So my only counterbalance to that is, I think that's fine, Damien. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, that's, again, that to me isn't, that doesn't run the risk of any kind of cultural offense. I mean, especially in the context of your game, you know, I think that's fine. I mean, I have my latest D&D game. The whole story before even COVID was an avatar of Demogorgon that was walking the land, spreading a plague, and the gnolls had aligned with her, and there were these human cults that aligned with her, and it wasn't until the climactic scene of the campaign that the players actually realize what's going on, and Yanoga and Demogorgon, who are both associated with plague and disease and madness and all these other things, are the ones who are behind like all the stuff that had been going on in the major stuff that had been going on in the campaign. So I think that's all fine. I don't think avoiding stuff like that is the answer. Now, if you've been like, oh, it's a certain type of person, ethnicity or whatever, that causes the plague, then I'd be like, because that was always a thing historically, even recently, of blaming a certain type of person for a disease but saying you have a mad doctor, like, an evil sorcerer, basically, a plague doctor. Yeah, I mean, that's not, that's a problem. This looks pretty sophisticated there. Looks like he did a good job really bringing in. So it looks like he's dealing a lot with the politics of this particular culture. That looks pretty cool. Yeah, Damien, you're right. The storytelling is, and that's a big part of what I talk about. I talked about this a lot in class. I've talked about, I talk about this a lot on these various chats. That part of it always is, what kind of story do you want to tell, and what is it necessary to add? Like, these really deep cultures are great. And if you could bring in even a glint of it. So the takeaway, I think, at least my opinion, it goes to with the world building details I talk about in the videos on YouTube, is that, can you find a way that it actually, and this is what we talked about with backstories a couple of weeks ago, is there a way that it can actually have an effect on your game? That it could be something that is important to the game's story. And if it's not important to the game's story, it's great to have notes on it, but it will really enhance your player experience or really enhance your experience. That's kind of where I go with all this stuff, really. So I think what I'm always curious about, like, when I'm reading this, and there's definitely like this whole political backdrop. What could be done to give these elves not just necessarily a unique place in the world in terms of their alignments, their political alignments, and their place in the narrative? What makes them really unique? What do they do that makes them really unique? What cultural habits do they have that are really unique? And I don't have an answer, and I think it's plenty. I think what he's got here is really interesting. I think it's also interesting that potential silk elf fashions. Yeah, the silk elves are actually, they definitely start to touch a little bit different drow. Okay. That's pretty interesting. These guys seem to have more of a kind of a unique identity. So where do they come from? That's what I'm interested in. I'm sure he has a write up. And I haven't really studied it, but and it's a thankless job too. I mean, the balancing act in all this is always tone complexion. Yeah, the silk elves look really different. They're kind of cool. So another example of this would be, I haven't this, as I've said, this D&D group that I run is fairly into straightforward D&D. I mean, they're open to all kinds of weird stuff, but they really want kind of a traditional fantasy game experience. I didn't spend a lot of time with Ravenloft because it's a very different game to take a group to Ravenloft for a period of time, especially if they're not high level. But at 7th level, I had them go through the mists of Ravenloft, just the outskirts of a dread realm, and I had them run into the caravanners that travel through the mist. And when you read the original Ravenloft material, and even some of the stuff before the most recent one, they're really bad gypsy stereotypes, like down to the thieving and the lying and everything. And you're just like, oh wow, Again, I forget what the name actually was in the supplements, but I did some alteration, and I made them into something a little bit. They all basically have. Who's it? Hey, it's Lisanne. How are you? Or you're almost coming at the end again. I know Wednesday nights are tough for you, but we're still going a little bit and talking about races or cultures. But so I decided that all of these people, these wanderers in the mists, were going to be in some way, shape, or form connected to something else. And I decided they would tentatively be aligned with tieflings and with the kind of infernal realms and demonic realms, but they're not evil. But this gave them the ability to move through realms and move through the mists. So they're kind of like these eternal caravanners. And I think it took away the really bad gypsy stereotype, because I didn't do a gypsy accent. I didn't pretend like they were Roma. I gave them their own identity, their own imagery. The fact that they had met in like this third or fourth game, they had met this tiefling fortune teller. I had her reappear there again with the caravan, and they'd been trying to find her for months. Game or year game time, longer in real time than I had her appear, and then they kind of made the connection that they were somehow connected to these beings that had elements of the other world. So that's how I kind of handled that. And the silk The Silk Elves remind me of that a little bit. That you could say, well, but are they kind of like Roma, etc.? Like I mentioned the Suat in my game, but they're not. They're their own identity. The fact they're itinerant happens to be their own. Happens to be their thing. He's got some good stuff up here. So I don't know, saying in your 44 year-long campaign of D&D, do you have any unique cultures floating around beyond the normal D&D races? I remember in the one city there was the one cult that were just throwing themselves into the pits with the giant snake, and I thought that was really bizarre and really interesting and really funny. Because it was like in the middle of this perfectly strange fantasy city, of all the things to run across, that really stuck out in my mind as like, wow, that was different. That was a very different view of it was almost Lovecraftian as well. And I know both you and Alan are deep into Lovecraft, but it definitely had that overtone too. Like I talked about in my game, the Varenka, who are kind of verging in that territory too. We've run the whole gamut tonight. Potentially offensive historical topics in gaming. How to make cultures unique. Are they even necessary? Is it necessary to make them historically accurate or based in any kind of historical setting? So I jump back here, look at this other link that Russell sent. Yeah, I seem to remember that. And that creates for an interesting dynamic too, though, right? When you think about all the cultures that came out of our own Middle Ages, that's basically what they were doing. They'd been decimated by war and plague, and they were kind of surviving off the ruins of the Roman Empire, right? I mean, that's back from war. I just talked about your little Ravenloft incursion and how I treated the nomadic people there instead of making the bad stereotype gypsies of first ed D&D that they were originally. I was like, how can I make these people different but not make them like right out of a really bad movie from the 70s? Well, there's appeal to that too, right? And like Damien was saying earlier, there's stereotypes sometimes help you tell the story, and it is true. Sometimes even bad stereotypes do, but you just have to differentiate what's the position, right? What's the position of this culture? We can draw in this stuff that's real world. We can draw in this stuff that's stereotype, but it's when we start to infer superiority or inferiority. Yes, that is definitely a whole other can of worms. Definitely. Well, that's a tactic for this too, right? I mean, magic changes everything in terms of making cultures and changing cultures. And I even talk about that in my own world. That there's absolutely no way that you can deny that this is a fantasy world and that these elements are going to shape these people in this world. I don't know. I think it's always an interesting topic. And again, I really in all my games I kind of go in both directions with it. In something like Tales of the Hallowed Land, because it's human centric, I feel like I had to make the cultures very distinct and do a lot of research into more or less modeling them off of some sort of familiar but not imitative culture. Whereas I wonder if you already have ogres and halflings and elves of various kinds, whether you have to do that much depth. But I think, and I started to say this a couple times and I circled around and got sidetracked as I tended to do, I think that if you put that little bit of extra cultural development in there, it makes it more real for the players too. I think even like if you see run across a town in the woods, even if it's your typical, let's see, yeah, yeah, and I think that kind of defines, and I know in your world specifically, it takes a forefront, but I wonder if in most fantasy games, if that isn't kind of a thing, that gold kind of becomes the pocket change, and the magic item is the. I know, like in Forgotten Realms, magic is basically, like technology, and it's tradable and it's usable, more so even than in when you get to Eberron. But yeah, yours kind of has that scavenging wasteland feel, right? Like it's not post-apocalyptic, but it almost kind of has that feel, only dealing with a fantasy setting where there is this small group of people vying for something. So do you feel that just evolved out of a standard D&D game, or was this something that you all kind of came up with initially as the premise for the world? Because that also interests me too. Like sometimes these things form as you play. Yeah, exactly. New iPhone for a Casio. I'll give it my iPhone for an instant for a castle with time travel. I'm in. Just say the word. Walk back in time with that iPhone, and you have a whole kingdom. You don't even have. Of course, there's probably no satellites to power it, but that's another discussion. The fact you can even take pictures with it, right, and make noises with it. You make the mistake of looking at your text in the middle of a stream, and you just see a bunch of really horrible digs, jokes coming at you from people you know. I don't know. I don't know if they're on the feed or not, but I'm just like, really, guys, really. Call Dean. Insert 2 years after. That's great. Well, it's kind of. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and that's kind of cool that it was actually a continuity from an earlier world. That was kind of our premise of the Blight Realms game too, which Tom and I've worked on, and we're hoping still to get going in some way, shape, or form. That there is this. You're essentially playing a post zombie apocalypse fantasy game. Basically. It's not quite that simple. But superficially, when the game first starts, it kind of feels like it's a zombie apocalypse fantasy game. But that's how I originally pitched it. He was very skeptical. And he even took it more fantasy than I would have. I was willing to make it more zombie horror, but he wanted to keep it more high fantasy. And since he's publishing it, it's his choice. And this game originally that I'm working on now, I originally had the concept of it being more like H.P. Lovecraft, end of Robert E. Howard stuff, but it ended up evolving into its own identity, which I think is good. I think every idea starts off like we're gonna have something derivative or something based off a previous thing, and then it takes its own identity on. All right, friends. I think I'm gonna wrap up this chat for tonight. I will have one more work session, Forge session, working on game stuff tomorrow, 11 to 1, where I just kind of work and talk and people come on and chat. And I'll take a look at your stuff, Bob, because if you come on tomorrow, I'll definitely talk about that a little more. Well, and that's you know what? That's a big thing too. For those of us who've been playing a really long time, even a little bit fresh means a lot, right? Catch you later, Justin. Even a little bit fresh goes a long way, right? Versus someone who's totally new to the genre. I don't know, Russell. Are you a photographer? I know you're knowledgeable in such things. I don't know if you actually did it. Yeah, that's what I thought. I thought you could do some do some photo work. I think we had discussed that, or at least we also enjoyed the technology end of it, talking about the technology end of it. But yeah, and so that's also, I think, in terms of the gaming end of things, my ambition was to create something that was even a little bit new, a little bit fresh, a little bit different. So, yeah, I will be away hopefully next week, if all goes well, through the following Tuesday. Um, I at that point I will not be streaming. I can't imagine I would have the time or facility or be that bored, but I guess one never knows. If I get COVID on the plane on the way over, maybe I'll be streaming from a hotel room. I don't know. Hopefully not. I really, really, really hope not. And then I hope to return. I will return with the regular streams the week after next. I'll see if I get back early enough. Maybe I will do a stream Wednesday night if things happen to fall into place. But I will be on tomorrow, and that'll be the last stream. But again, thanks for everyone for coming on and chatting. Give the usual spiel. Find us on Twitch. Find us on YouTube. Like and subscribe if you're watching this and you enjoy what you're seeing and hearing, or if you come by it later. Fox and Board Games. And I'm really appreciative of everybody who comes on and chats. Yeah, definitely. We hope we have fun. Yeah, thank you. Hope we'll be able to get some fun in, get some nice pictures, see some live music. Gonna be going to a metal festival. It's one of the things we'll be doing while we're over there. So the main thing we're actually going for this time. For this trip, we have a family trip to see family overseas later in the year, but this is going to be a music outing. Hopefully it'll all go well. So I'll leave the chat open for a minute or two. But again, thanks everybody for coming on, and I'll see you in a week or two.